Something very sacred needed to be fulfilled with this union, and I didn't understand it concretely. It was an opportunity for both of us, and for my part, I wasn't willing to let it evaporate. The next day it was 7:30 in the morning, and I started to cry. Especially because I knew that at 9 o'clock this morning I wouldn't be there, but God only knows where. But before 8 o'clock, an open-back pickup truck pulled up in front of the Ghost House. It was her. She had a few things to keep with me. I welcomed her with indescribable joy. My retreat had begun, though I didn't know it. Those were some very special days of rest. In the afternoons, we went for walks, but she had said goodbye to her family, and her intuition told her I shouldn't enter her parents' house, because I needed to find myself. Later, I would enter their house only once, and then only after almost 3.5 years, almost at the end of this wonderful and admirable cycle of my life. She would stay at the Ghost House, while I went to work with Shea, and later with my new partner at the center, which we named Nueva Era 2000, which, as I said, was located at the back entrance of the Las Americas movie theater. In the evenings, my friend, with his Americo Living Trail 153 party spirit, liked to invite us to dinner. Then we would first stop by Victoria Street, to pick up my beloved. I would arrive at the Ghost House for young ladies, accompanied by my partner, who, due to his strong Leo astrological sign, was always very cheerful and loud-voiced, cracking jokes and seeing life in a positive light. When I stood in front of the balcony of the house, I could see her gazing out at the street. Seeing us, she remained serious, but I know that deep down, her heart warmed. It was a brief time, when she had to stay retired, and I had to be out on the street doing some work. And the same force that drew her into my life, gave her the courage to stop seeing her family for all these days at the beginning of my retirement. By being so openly on my side, she was excluded from the plot my naturism group was plotting to enter into dealings with Shea without informing me. And they were very careful to ensure that she wasn't present or aware of the date on which their graduation diplomas would be issued. My companion felt the strange rejection, and began to stop attending naturism classes. However, when graduation was over, and I found out everything, I managed to get her diploma signed by Dr. Shea Mitchin to give to the best of my students. The attitude of my students was strange, because just a few days before they received their diplomas in this way, the Shea Mitchin Naturist Centers were invited to actively participate in a national symposium on alternative medicine. The event took place near the center of Mexico City, at the former University of San Ildefonso. It was a beautiful day, and around 50 groups of Mexican royal healers, based on indigenous traditions, attended. Not all of them were university graduates. That day, my relationship with Shea was still good, and in the main auditorium, there was a table of honor with figures, sent by the Mexican government to channel the movement, as well as the event's promoters and Mexico's most prominent curators. When I entered this large hall, I found myself sitting in one of the comfortable spectator seats with the then manager of the Oro Center. We greeted each other, and then, like everyone else, I was worried, because Dr. Shea had turned a blind eye, that is, he was nowhere to be seen, and his place at the table of honor was empty. My manager friend, I, and many others sincerely loved the doctor, even though he often couldn't appreciate how much we loved him. For example, once upon a time, the manager, knowing my loyalty to Shea, was kind enough to invite me to participate in the meetings at the Oro Center, where they were trying to form a group of healing directors in advanced alternative medicine. Of course, a terrible lack of camaraderie among the members prevented this effort from taking shape. And we were always trying to justify Dr. Shea's shortcomings to others. Americo Living Trail 154. So, at the auditorium, the manager made me feel the need to go find the doctor, and I did. After wandering around this beautiful old university for a while, I found him. He looked like a kid hiding, so he wouldn't be forced to go to the auditorium, where everyone was counting on him. I asked him why he was acting so antisocial. He tried to explain that he didn't know, but that those people made him nervous. I couldn't convince him to give in, and he simply maintained his childish stance of not going to take his seat. It seemed inconceivable to me that a man like Shea, with his great business standing, wouldn't be willing to support an alternative medicine fraternity. But I also don't think you can expect a man to be perfect in everything. It was enough that he had shown Largifu that it is possible to reconcile a spiritual endeavor with economic and material reality. That day, my naturism students followed me with great devotion and respect. There were about 40 of them, and they were proud that I was their director. They never left my side, and I felt like a father, so close were they to me throughout the tour I took through the old university. They took pictures and joked around, creating an unforgettable aquarium party. What's more, my new classmate was dressed all in white, with a skirt that reached above her knees. She seemed to shine like the sun. One of my students was a woman who liked me, and had told me that, if she had been a young girl, she would have surely won me over. This afternoon, as I stood in the ground floor garden of the university, gazing at a beautiful fountain, she approached me and said, "Master, I just perceived him as he truly is." He was dressed in white, with long hair and the face of a great master. Then I closed my eyes, because I didn't want to see any more. It was too much for me. And, yet despite all these positive attitudes, a few days later, it happened that the students, behind my back, went to receive their diplomas. It was a typical event of Christian romanticism. We first welcome the one we love with pomps, and then immediately dispatch them. Anyway, that day, at the old University of San Ildefonso, I was able to spend time with my students, and one in particular started taking pictures of us. We had a mutual respect for each other, and also for my girlfriend, who was also his classmate at the naturism school. This student was a good tailor, and appreciated me so much that months ago he had given me 3 custom-made suits. And one of them was the white suit I wore this time to the event at this venue. And as I said, she was also wearing white. By the way, as we headed toward the hotel that night to be together that day, she felt restless. And when I asked her what was wrong, she explained that she didn't like wearing white because she felt naked. And since I didn't understand, she told me it was because when a person wears white clothes, it's easier to see the colors of their aura. And she didn't like that. Americo Living Trail 155. I was aware that most people can't see the colors of the aura, and don't even imagine that such a thing could exist. But for me, a confidant, this was something natural. And in this regard, one day he had said to me, referring to what I had made him say, by hanging out with me, "Everyone at the naturist school has a greenish aura, which can be interpreted as a half-baked character. On the other hand, you and I have blue auras, which isn't common." That topic interested me, and it reminds me of a time in downtown Tabasco. She hurried out of the bathroom, and I, who was waiting for her outside, was surprised when she excitedly said, "Here in this bathroom, since it's somewhat dim, it's possible to see the aura through the mirror. I wish you could see it." The fact is that now, I had taken a unique step in my life, thanks, in part, to all these people who supported me. And, besides, the heroine of my world was just like any other woman, because one of those afternoons she told me we would go to the mall, which was next to the India's Birds metro station. That's where we bought some sheets and bedspreads. As we walked through the store she suddenly stopped and looked thoughtful, then she started laughing to herself, saying, "What madness is this?" It was obvious that he was talking about a distraught situation. He took my hand, and we continued walking. We were happy. I was once doing yoga, and she came over, so we started talking. For some reason, she remembered her teacher and said, "I know a lot of things that people don't appreciate. For example, something I really like is boosting energy, based on tuning into the solar spectrum." Next, she showed me what that technique consisted of, and I realized that she practiced it a lot, and that it was what gave her a lot of willpower. She also added another exercise that consisted of squeezing her anus and genitals over and over again in sync with her breathing. Obviously, this type of practice isn't recommended without the supervision of someone knowledgeable in the matter. But for me, it's highly beneficial, especially the solar spectrum tuning technique, which would be a true panacea, especially during the most demanding times of my life, during my retirement. For now, I had dared to take the step toward my freedom, in a decisive and determined manner. I was willing to be happy and to preserve it, no matter what the cost. Something that on this planet, seems to be prohibited, since it is generally known that the majority of America Living Trail 156 humanity spends a greater percentage of their lives in suffering and negative attitudes, and very little lasting happiness. The vision of the desert and the black ascended. The last few times she was still attending the naturism school. Once, as always, I entered through the room where the stairs leading directly to the naturism school are located. At the foot of the stairs was a very comfortable armchair, a kind of individual recliner, where one could comfortably rest one's head while remaining seated. This is where I sometimes liked to settle down for a moment and close my eyes, especially in those moments when I had found the woman of my life and thought about what I would have to do to keep her, and, at the same time, ensure my family in Teotihuacan was well. Aware, more or less, that these were the trials of the path, and I wanted them not to interfere with my existence in a destructive way. My eyes were closed, and suddenly, a beautiful vision appeared. I was here, feeling my body, but also capturing what was happening inside my head, with this clairvoyance, which was unusual for me. I gazed at a vast desert where the wind and the gale would suddenly rise, stirring up the sand and dust. And the solitude remained so for a long time. But it seemed as if I were right there in the desert. I watched for what seemed like over an hour, and little by little, in the distance, it seemed like something was moving. About 10 more minutes passed, and that figure began to approach. It was a man walking slowly. He was approaching where I was standing, observing the wonderful and inhospitable desert, because nothing was alive here, except dust and the hum of the air. As this man came closer, I was filled with happiness, because he was a monk dressed in white, quite tall, and his skin was black. But his eyes showed enormous wisdom. He was definitely a great master. When I saw his face, his eyes were not looking at me, but rather at eternity, both inward and outward. At that moment, the vision disappeared, and I felt myself sitting back in the chair in Shea's high school dorm. No more than a quarter of an hour had passed. That afternoon I had a date with my secret companion, so after leaving the naturism school, she and I went to the movies. At one point, she said, "It's time to go back." I noticed she was getting restless as we rode on the public bus, and she confessed to me. At the cinema, there was a giant behind us, or rather, a man over 2 meters tall. He caught my attention, because his skin color was black. "It's true, I saw it this morning too, but I forgot to tell you," I replied enthusiastically. America Living Trail 157. So you've seen it too. Does that mean I'm not hallucinating, but that many times, what I perceive is true? He is a man who resembles Saint Martin de Porres, who is also black, and his eyes show the presence of a great master, I added. From then on, at that stage, that man began to care for us, of course from the invisible plane. She tried to talk to him while, for example, we were in my partner's office at the corner of Chilpancingo and Insurgents. But the master brought his index finger to his mouth, and said to her in his mind, "Keep quiet and pay attention to what they are doing." All the scare towards us made me suspect that things were not easy, that many energies were fighting to obstruct this relationship from which something very different could emerge from what I had experienced at the GFU. As for vision, I was not obsessed with the desire to develop extrasensory faculties, but simply wished to retain my practical sense and my taste for human and natural life. From Victory to Jose Marti. Less than 10 days later, the owner of the Ghost House in Victoria came knocking on my door. My roommate and I were having a private conversation, but her knocking was so insistent that I barely had time to get dressed. I opened the door, still red-faced and bare-chested, and allowed her to see me, which made her even more serious and worried than usual. "I've come to deliver this envelope prepared by my lawyers so that, within 3 days, if possible, you may vacate this room, please," she warned me point-blank, more frivolously than ever. I was definitely very angry, because he didn't communicate in time about the need for us to leave. Anyway, there was very little time to vacate. We had nowhere to change, and with a voice trembling with surprise, I wanted to retort. But she insisted again, so I wouldn't forget. "I can't wait any longer. This room has to be vacated in 3 days at the most," was his devastating decree. Without further ado, the lady left. I closed the door, and my roommate's face was white from the unpredictability of what had happened. However, I discovered strength in her core. I had a strong faith that we would make it through, no matter what. This gave me strength. Americo Living Trail 158. So the next day I went to see the juice man, who was based in Oro High School, right at the entrance. He respected me, and had become my friend, and since he had to carry vegetables and cereals almost every day to stock his store, I thought he must know a lot of people. That's why I asked him to put me in touch with someone who had transportation. He told me he'd try to arrange it in the afternoon, and that I should visit him the next day. Meanwhile, we spent our time buying the morning papers and desperately searching for a place to relocate. I had 1,000 pesos in my pocket, and the minimum rent I knew was a deposit plus another 1,500 pesos. That's about 3,000 pesos, at the very least. That's hoping they wouldn't ask us for guarantor or anything like that. We didn't lose faith, and in the newspaper we found the place asking for 900 pesos for the first monthly payment, with no deposit or anything else. It was located almost at the intersection of Viaducto and Insurgents. The street was called Jose Marti. We immediately went to the place, and the entrance had two enormous columns painted violet, so that, to get through, you had to go between the columns. And I couldn't help but immediately think to myself, as in the tests, initiations, of Freemasonry. A young boy led the way. Then an older man appeared and showed us the place he was renting. It was nothing more than a run-down, small mansion-type house. It looked completely unoccupied, to me. But it had clearly been used as a prostitution business. However, there was no time to ask questions, or to ponder or reason. The man headed toward the back entrance. It consisted of a pleasant little entryway, then a living room/bedroom with a small wooden dresser and an old double bed. Then, next to it, a bathroom, and a small kitchenette. Without much thought, we made a deal, so we took out our 900 pesos, and gave them to the man, who was very pleased. Early the next day, I was standing in front of my friend's juice shop on called El Oro, near the corner of Monterrey, when he opened his business. He greeted me cheerfully, but then told me he hadn't been able to locate the man who did his moving. That can't be right. I need a ride, and I need it right now, I said in an imperative tone. He realized I was very serious. It was time to prove to me, if he was truly my friend. Please give me half an hour, he said very worried. I will try to locate a transport, even if it is not that big. It doesn't matter, if I have to go around twice to move my things, I told him quickly. I stood there waiting and calling upon the masters. Half an hour later, a man driving a large car with no back seats showed up. We quickly made the deal, and within 40 minutes, I was at the Ghost House in Victoria. Americo Living Trail 159. My companion was waiting for me anxiously, as the woman was being protected, veiled, of course, by her son, whom I had never seen in the Ghost House, to visit his mother before, except at this very moment. It was evident that he had come to look after her, at her request, as the time had come for us to leave this house no matter what. My friend had already told me that, in that boarding house for young ladies, she sensed the presence of the lady's husband. He had already passed away years before, and she hadn't wanted to let him go. But when we arrived, according to my friend, the gentleman was able to find rest and peace, and stop wandering around the house. Thought that this must have been what made the lady uncomfortable, and besides, since it was a house of young ladies, we, with our liberal love, were surely mistaken for simple adventurers. We loaded our things and there was not even room for a pin. The car was just right for our few belongings. The driver, who was very resourceful in accommodating everything, said it was ready. We settled into the car next to him and set off. Within an hour, we were on Jose Marti Street, taking possession of our new home. Inside, there was a subtle scent of sex. But on the other hand, it also had a refrigerator, a table, and a sunny, tiny sitting area at the entrance. The bathroom had a shower and a few other amenities here and there. It was a bargain. The first night here was fine, despite the rush of the change, and we were able to breathe easy again. The next day we went for a walk, and discussed the sadness in the eyes of the boy who lived with this man who was definitely not his father. Almost without thinking, my companion said, "This child is being sexually harassed by that man." I thought for a moment, and realized that he was very likely right. I let him know, but we felt it best to be cautious given our situation. We began to realize that at night this entire area was filled with prostitutes and homosexuals. so we were definitely in the eye of the storm. This was a red light district. One of these afternoons, while we were meditating, my companion told me we had company. The masters wanted to talk to me, and she was the intermediary. I'm a Tibetan and you're going to form It is the line of Lalaburden, love and Laverded. Soon after, another couple moved into this strange, lonely, run-down hotel. They were both young, but it was clear she held a strong hold on him, who seemed rather fooled. Americo Living Trail 160. We preferred not to engage in a friendly relationship with them, as we knew how delicate our situation was. It was around this time that we sometimes went for walks. We crossed the expressway called Viaducto, which ran parallel to Jose Marti Street. And we went to eat at a place that served excellent quesadillas, buffet service, and everything at a reasonable price. Other times, we went to the popular bookstore called La Pyramide, which is known for selling esoteric books, and was almost next to our place of residence. And once, specifically, I don't know if the masters suggested it, or it was her own initiative, she wanted us to go to the University of Mexico, UNAM, located toward the south of the city. We arrived there, and the first thing we did was sit by the sidewalk that leads to Capilco Street and enjoy a pizza that seemed extra large to me. Then we walked toward the large esplanade of the rector's office, where I showed her the Faculty of Philosophy, where I used to attend years ago. At times, she walked over there, and I walked over here. And as we were heading back, she told me about when I was standing on the esplanade, right in front of my philosophy department. She saw me as I had surely dressed, in other lives, when I had been a famous professor at an important European university. And that I had been very famous. So it was quite possible that in this life it wasn't right for me to stay here, at UNAM, to repeat the same thing. I had to move on. That afternoon, during the bus ride, I was so tired that I fell asleep, and just as we were about to arrive, she woke me up. And I could see that she was vigilant and full of love, watching over me. It was very similar to those times when I was little, and one day I collected those little animals called chichikolotes, which are found in murky water. It was a wealthy people's house, because at one time my father had dealings with such people, and did welding work in important houses. And I remember well that day my dad helped me get a bottle to put my chichikolotes in, which I drank from an empty fountain in those people's house. And as I fell asleep on the bus, when I woke up, he was looking at me with a tenderness rarely shown toward me, while he placed in my hands my precious treasure, which, as I fell asleep, he had dropped from my hands. But back to what she and I experienced together. I was beginning to realize that despite so much sweetness, the troubles were far from over. Because one night she was asleep, and I had my eyes closed, thanking life for everything it had given me. And suddenly, I felt a strange, not to say terrifying, presence. I couldn't move from the shock, although I could see, feel, and hear, but I was paralyzed. I heard a muffled moan, like someone dying. It was right on the same bed we were sleeping in, and the worst part was that the mattress was moving at a rhythm, like someone repeatedly burying a dagger into a body that should have been lying precisely where I was. The next day I told my roommate. She was sufficiently frightened, and amidst our fear and confusion, we began to consider the possibility of moving away from here. For a start, we decided to go through the drawers of the old dresser in our bedroom, and there were some photos of half-naked men with noticeably homosexual faces. We didn't want to stay in this house anymore. So we left our things here, and, while we looked for another place, we stayed in more decent hotels than this one. Thus began a very unusual stage in our experience, for while we were in our own city, we nevertheless began to live a life, as if we were strangers in our own homeland. Americo Living Trail 161. But with her, everything seemed filled with light. Her strength was such, and her love for me so strong, that it definitely inspired and defined me. I had experienced sexuality with other couples, and this wasn't just sex, even though with her I could extend our intimate relationship to 2 or 3 hours, sometimes longer. She was about 4 years younger, and she had fully awakened her sexuality with me. But neither she nor I were truly vulgar in our way of having sex, we were simply very passionate, like we'd never been before. I couldn't convince anyone that this wasn't simple sex, but a true union between two energies, not just between our personalities. But I can say that the experience was that, through sex, we became more planetary, and united with humanity in a very special, metaphysical, or cosmic way. After my retreat, I was able to understand that our union must have been planned from the beginning by invisible forces of light, and that later, we had already been together physically in past lives, always under adverse, but passionate, conditions. Her husband was neither a friend nor a lover of hers, but merely a kind of father to his daughter, whom he saw as a wife when necessary. Anyway, while this was happening in our lives, she had to do her makeup at the hotel. As for me, I sometimes had to go to the Shea Center, and put on my costume there, in one of the annexes within the center. Then I'd walk out, as if nothing had happened, and give the talk to the students. It was on one of these mornings in Oro, that she began to channel Master Estrada, who told me, "Brother, your path is roses without thorns. Don't forget it." We managed to get a small room in a ghost house a block and a half from Jose Marti. By then, she had already decided to use the car she had stored at her marital home, which belonged to her husband. So, having expedited the weekly rental of this sort of house hotel, one very early morning we arrived by car to the strange hotel, which seemed more like a portal to another kind of unknown underworld, very different from what its facade appeared to be when facing the street. We got out of the car, and went through the gate with its purple columns. Fortunately, the gentleman wasn't there. We unpacked all our belongings and immediately transported them to the ghost house located nearby. There weren't many items, but I had a lot of work going up and down that day, since our new room was on the first floor. This new ghost house was more appropriate for a different kind of social outcast or vagrant. And I think the name of the boulevard was Popocatépetl, 2 blocks from Insurgents and Chilpancingo. We had been at Jose Marti's house for about 2 months. This little room was much smaller. It consisted of only a bathroom with a shower, sink, and toilet, a living room/bedroom, and a small closet. But as the weeks passed, it became a magical place, and soon, we arrived at May 1, 1992. Americo Living Trail 162. Meanwhile, her car would end up being stored at her mother's house. Because once, when we left it parked, the tire caps had already been stolen that morning. Then she remembered the dream she had had that morning, in which 2 angels guarding the car hadn't been able to fight off some thugs who had stolen something from the car. But it was about a month ago, when we were staying at a hotel near Cuauhtemoc Avenue and Alvaro Obregón Street. The next morning, we had to leave early, because our vehicle wasn't allowed to drive that day, according to our license plate number, and we had to arrive with Shea before 6 in the morning. But it was around 6:15 in the morning, and some police officers, who looked more like night owls hunting for unwary people, caught up with us, and charged us money to avoid a fine. And we weren't that well off, so things like this are what made us decide to leave his car stored at his mom's house. True sexuality. Ever since I met the mother of my children, I've always tried to boost my energy during sex, hoping to one day avoid ejaculating. But my partner was so unconscious about this, that she wasn't helpful. I wasn't ready to discuss the subject, and it never would have occurred to me to bring it up with her. Then, in Saint Germain's The Golden Book, I learned to say, "I'm the resurrection and the life," while having sexual contact with my partner. The change wasn't much, but I tried it from time to time. So when I had a stable relationship with my new partner, I began to advance meteorically in this regard. She was so designed, and I was so prepared to unite with her, that I was able to retain my ejaculation longer and longer. Until sometimes I didn't ejaculate at all. Although during the next sexual encounter, I preferred to do so to feel satisfied. But all this energy wasn't completely lost in the body, it began to rise to my head. Slowly but surely. At first, it was imperceptible. But little by little, sex became my spiritual nourishment, not just emotional and physical. It was a happiness that ordinary people can't experience, because they have absolutely no control over their instincts. This woman was the magic, but so was I, having trained for about 7 years, before I met her. And then with her, 1 hour of sex was like having sex for a month with my former partner, due to la qualité spirituelle of this sexual union. And so 1 year was equivalent to an entire sexual lifetime for an ordinary human. All of this allows us to understand that when sexuality is subjugated to conscious love, it becomes a perfect instrument for the evolution of the being. And one begins to convince oneself that sexuality is not a hindrance, but a very dangerous weapon, that is truly a divine blessing for awakening to a higher state of consciousness. With all of this, I destroyed all the rules of celibacy so widely disseminated by the so-called sacred initiatory tradition of the GFU institution. This uninhibited sexuality worked for me, especially because my attitude wasn't obsessive about la technique sex, but rather totally loved my partner. I didn't. Americo Living Trail 163 always ejaculate, however, and it was never my idea to take non-ejaculation as the goal of all sexual relations. That is, non-ejaculation is the main idea, but not the goal. The fundamental goal is love. This was how, in my own experience, I derived sexuality from vulgar pornography. Mainly because, by nature and due to my spiritual training, I was only designed to respond to a monogamous relationship, which is generally more difficult to achieve. I'm referring to la monogamia, than celibacy itself. This attitude is what allows us to treat our partner as the most sacred act in our lives, always ensuring the well-being of the other. To the point that sexual relations are not limited to the time of intercourse, but are present at all times. Wedding in the presence of the Satgurus of the era. That May 1st, 1992, we were in our little love room. I had spent wonderful hours with her, and then we lay down to rest in this heavenly state. I knew that this day, according to the initiation dates of La GFU, was celebrated as Guru's Day. Suddenly, I began to sense a happier atmosphere in this small room. An atmosphere filled with peace, love, and the presence of indescribable light. She became serious and focused, as she always did when someone called her inside, and said to me, "I see Master de la Ferrier approaching." This made me very alert, because he described the master as I knew him in the photographs, his blonde hair and his Templar clothing. A few moments later, Master Estrada and the Tibetan appeared. The first to speak was the master, La Ferrier, telling me through her brother, "You've come to break up with her La Sagrada Tradición, not because you'll stop obeying her, but because you'll do it in a very different way." On the other hand, the energy that you and she produce every time you have sex is beautiful. It's an energy that we see moving from plane to plane, and reaching far away in time and space, reaching other dimensions in your inner beings, and this, brother, is very good, but also dangerous, because as soon as this energy is set in motion, it works like a boomerang, where what is launched as a cause returns as an effect, and if what is necessary and correct is not done, that boomerang will cut your head off. The three masters, seated in the lotus position, did so in such a way that we had to be in the center. All this while we were on the bed in our small room. I couldn't perceive their bodies, but I did perceive their presence, because the room was filled with the purest love. Then, through my companion, they said, "We are going to marry them, and they must know that this is a very high privilege, because never on the planet have a couple been consecrated in a wedding by the three Satgurus of the era." Americo Living Trail 164. Each of them gave us their blessing, and the Tibetan master in particular said, "This is your perfect match, unrivaled in this world or any other. She's yours." Before leaving, Master Estrada told me, "Stay alert to everything we say, and then, you will let the world know, and when they ask you who told you all this, you will answer, higher education." "And where does higher education come from?" Professor Estrada continued explaining, "Higher education is La Enseñanza Superior." When the teachers retired, I felt great joy, but I also began to sense a great responsibility in my life. Events accelerated, and later the Tibetan told us, "Little by little, you are beginning to live 7 times 7, that is, when an hour passes, for you, the experience is already 7 hours, when a week passes, it is 7 weeks, and so on." However, this does not mean that you will grow older in appearance, although you will actually live at that pace. Towards the Americas, the Gold Institute had problems with its management, and misunderstandings with Shyamichan's family put the business system in crisis, so they were no longer interested in the school of transformative astrology. Left alone and aware that I would no longer receive support from the radio station or the owners of this center, I spoke with my students in an extraordinary session, and told them that, if they wanted to continue with the school, school, we would have to move to my new center, across from the Las Americas movie theater. There were between 15 and 20 students, but they knew me, and had been studying with me for months. They were the ones who survived the entire process out of more than 300 people. They wanted to complete their course, so we left right away as a group, and after a 20-minute walk along Insurgents Avenue, we arrived at the new place called Nueva Irdu's Mill. Everything seemed fine at the start, but the truth was that my partner seemed a bit uncomfortable, and began to behave a little strangely, so much so that he didn't join the group he previously belonged to, but rather felt different. But without us noticing, according to him, during class he sat at the desk in the entrance, very close to the thin drywall wall next to the space where I stood to speak to the group. Later he decided that his son-in-law would also participate with us, and this no longer gave me a good feeling. Americo Living Trail 165. Through the newspaper, he called on some teenage girls to train them to promote astrology, offering horoscope birth charts in various places. Of course, I realized he must have taken advantage of the same group we'd had since Shayamichan. But he had already shown signs of being estranged from this group. I knew his birth chart, and I could see from it that he tended to betray the group. Of course, I wasn't in the business of limiting him, and wanted to see what was really happening. For a few more months, we maintained our friendship and mutual tolerance, but one day, when I wasn't there, he said to my friend, he thinks he's a white elephant. Although the last thing I wanted was the end of the group or my society, the results were clearly coming. Teotihuacan and the rescue of the children. Meanwhile, the situation in Teotihuacan wasn't going smoothly. From the moment I left my former partner and my children there, the expected manipulations began. At first she realized that Guru Marcelli no longer treated her the same, so I don't know how or why exactly, she began to consider Diaz Porta as her teacher. He befriended a fanciful person who had an ashram very close by, also in the Teotihuacan area, and who said he was preparing for the final catastrophe on the planet, since he was the one chosen to give all the people of the world a drink based on cactus. I began to realize there was more than just friendship between my former colleague and this person, but this no longer concerned me. Besides, my colleague was conveniently happy with me, and I went along with the idea that we were friends. While I didn't really resent her, I no longer felt any connection to her either. Things started to get difficult, because he wasn't showing his true feelings, but he had happily accepted my relationship with my new partner. I remember this contrast between the two women very well when one day my former classmate unexpectedly arrived at the naturism school, where I was teaching. My students greeted her, as if nothing had happened, but in reality, she was interfering in my private life. But at the same time, this gave me a great opportunity to convince myself who's who. Because my new roommate, far from getting furious as might be expected, went and greeted her, as if they were old friends. Then the three of us walked to the street corner, and when we got there, my new roommate made me feel that perhaps I had a lot to discuss with the mother of my children, and that it was best for her to leave, and so she did. She was wearing a silk dress that made her look more youthful, and as she walked away, I could appreciate her distinction, not only in appearance but in everything. Americo Living Trail 166. Anyway, as fate would have it, one of my students from the naturism school lived in San Juan Teotihuacan, just a few blocks from the children's new home. So I decided to talk to her, so that when I couldn't personally deliver the bi-weekly money to the children's mother, she would kindly deliver it. The bad thing about this was, that this person became friends with my ex-partner, who ultimately convinced her of her role as a victim. Then, that student stopped seeing me as a true teacher, and turned me into the villain of the movie, so much so, that she began to be a bad influence on my school. I tried to cope as best I could, but the time came when I had to continue commuting to Teotihuacan every 2 weeks or month, fortunately using my new partner's car. So, my new companion usually let me drive her car, and together we would visit the children. We liked to sit atop the Pyramid of the Sun and chat. It was noticeable how in those moments she transformed into a more severe and peaceful being. Her hair would wave, and I would gaze at her with a certain reverence, almost without my trying. The energy of the place changed, as a result of our presence in these places, considered sacred by Mexican tradition. That's why I wasn't so surprised when, on our way back from Teotihuacan to Mexico City, we began to be surrounded by several small lights that, unlike ordinary airplanes, hovered far away in the sky, right in front of us. They were UFOs, and that afternoon, while I was driving along the highway, one of them brazenly approached and hovered above our car, at a height of no more than a kilometer. It was gold in color, circular in shape, and had a diameter of 700 metros. She was so filled with happiness, that she almost scared me, because at that moment I thought that she was really an alien and maybe she was playing with me, a simple human. That night through her the masters told me, "You've already seen some of the ships we have, so you can't doubt, because now you have proof." Another time we visited Teotihuacan, when we returned to our little room 2 blocks from La Espiga. They told me, "This woman has the power to activate the pyramids, especially because of what she herself is becoming at this moment for the planet, along with you." Things were becoming fantastic, and therefore also dangerous. But at the same time, it was fascinating, because the internal processes I was beginning to experience with her and everything around me, I can only describe as enormous happiness, a kind of ecstasy. It was also due, in some way, to the fact that all this was happening at a unique cosmic moment, that is, the new age called Aquarius. Indeed, despite the tremendous pressure she was under with a husband she was considering separating from, we sometimes had the opportunity to stay together in a hotel very close to the pyramids of Teotihuacan, and the experience was a departure from the ordinary world of people. I mean, it was seemingly normal, but the pace of life, so to speak, was different. Americo Living Trail 167. This would later lead me to confide in her, that are hard to describe, about who she was, and who I was, and what we were in our past lives. It wasn't that I was worried about that. In fact, I liked the present. But suddenly one comment or another would come up, like a normal part of our daily lives. That's how it was, in relation to the pyramids. She once told me that, years ago, while at home, she saw on the television news, that they had removed the mummy of a very important Egyptian queen from beneath the pyramid. And she began to feel upset, and sickened by this outrage. Because she was suddenly certain it was her own self from a past life. And that removing it from the sacred energy, produced by being buried there, even though she was already mummified. However, it affected her in the present, so she was forced to meditate more to feel better. Then, as if nothing had happened, another time later, he told me that our current masters, some of the Satgurus, had spoken to him about the time we were in Rome or Egypt, with whom we had interacted as guides to the people. But they didn't exactly explain to him who we were, or that she lived through World War II in France. And when she was a teenager, and bombs were falling from the air, dropped by fighter planes, she would run under the bed, terrified, and always get stuck on her lower back, because the bed was too low and her bottom and legs didn't fit properly. To understand what this relates to her present, I must clarify that in this incarnation, she had the degree in computer science from the Polytechnic Institute. Although, like me, she hadn't finished her degree, because the esoteric and her inner commitments to her enlightened acupuncture teacher absorbed her greatly, and she had little time for anything else. But once, in order to review some horoscopic birth chart software on the computer, we went to her Polytechnic school on Plutarco Avenue, near the Sports Palace. And that's how I got to know the atmosphere of her university. But what really began to catch her attention was teaching classes to sailors at a major power plant, located less than a kilometer from where I attended high school, called CCH Orient, Eastern College of Sciences and Humanities. Something that was easier for her, because it was close to Apixa, the polytechnic where she studied computer science. Everything came naturally to her. When I asked her why that would happen, since I noticed he had a great affection for the sailors, and besides, his acupuncture teacher, the Enlightened One, was an important naval commander, he told me, "I'm convinced that during World War II in France, I had to become a prostitute out of survival needs, and the sailors were the ones who frequented the place where I worked the most." So, because of this, in the Navy, she had taught computer science classes for a while, and had earned the friendship of some chiefs, particularly a female captain who had come to love her very much. All of this was fascinating, and for that very reason, not easy to accept. It requires a lifetime of training to truly believe these realities. Anyway, when she was motivated by my erotic temperament, she suddenly became thoughtful, and immediately told me that in the days of Europe, when women wore full skirts and corsets, we once met, and it was very Americo Living Trail 168 difficult for me to lift her starched skirt and remove her underwear so that, in a secluded spot in the woods where we had slipped away, I could make love to her. So, if all this was leading me forward, even if it was only for the sake of living, as if I were out of time. In addition to being able to add to this, I could be sure that a higher divine energy had taken us, and was guiding us. These were times of great activity, because the journey to the pyramids of Teotihuacan was not easy, due to all the moral, economic, family, and work pressures that were reflected in not having a stable place to live. Given the economic circumstances, one day I considered visiting a less frequented place affiliated with Chichen Itza and the GFU. It was Villa de las Flores, Cocalco, located north of Mexico City. A place that years later, after my retirement, would be very important in my life. But at that moment, my goal was simply to earn a little money. So once, my new companion went with me to that place where the owner, a faithful admirer and protege of Chichen Itza, welcomed me gladly. But the conditions were not favorable, and little by little I stopped going to this beloved center. On March 21, 1991, as always on this day of the year, the first boys' entrance is celebrated in Teotihuacan, and a large crowd usually attends. My former classmate invited me, because Maestro Diaz-Porta would be there, and she asked me to take advantage of the opportunity, to try to get the maestro to cut the eldest boy's hair. My companion refused to attend, and I had to go alone. When I arrived at the Pyramid of the Sun, the sad story of the Tibetan lamas being turned away by a group of Mexicans dressed in black was taking place. And then everything ended well. The mother of my children led me to the foot of the Pyramid of the Moon, and gave me a quartz as a symbol that our old love would continue, now in an everlasting friendship. I could tell she was being sincere, but I wasn't entirely in agreement with this promise. Although I was respectful of her feelings, we returned to the Pyramid of the Sun in search of Master Diaz-Porta. Later, Master Diaz-Porta cut our eldest son's hair, right in front of the Pyramid of the Sun. When I returned home with my current partner, I was scolded by the invisible teachers, saying, "You've already addressed your issue, but you don't realize what's happening to you, or how long it will take to shake off all the negativity that clings to you. Because when you attend important events on special dates, and in sacred places, everything you come into contact with there leaves such a strong impression that sometimes it takes years to shake it off until it no longer has any real influence on you." I realized that the masters wanted to prepare me, by keeping me in retreat, so that I could manage certain cosmic energies, and no longer be like a puppet, moved by sentimental, superficial fraternal and family circumstances, which, in reality, made me unhappy. Americo Living Trail 169. One day when for an exceptional reason I went to Netzahulcoyotl's house, my mother told me. The daughter's mother, who owns the house in Teotihuacan where the children live, spoke and said she urgently needed to speak with you. Sensing they weren't anything good, I wanted to find out what it was about first, without doing so directly. I asked someone in my family to please answer the woman's call. My temper wasn't completely under control. And the woman assured him, "We haven't had any problems with the man, who is the children's father. He's a very kind person, and we appreciate him. But tell him I need him to vacate the house, because the children's mother lets random people in, and we've heard he's hanging around with some of them, and that's not good for the children or for us. We no longer want to rent to him." Shortly after, I met up with the mother of my children, and discovered that old friends had taken over the place as a hotel, which made it easier for them to visit the Teotihuacan pyramids more often. They were people from Kundalini Yoga, GFU, and especially from the Matis movement, something that had to do with the indigenous wisdom of Mexico, but sometimes handled in a rather strange way. Already at La Jifta University, I had learned that some groups had not correctly followed the teachings of Master Diaz-Porta, and were causing scandal by using drugs, and indulging in orgies and their rituals. I didn't directly verify anything at the house in Teotihuacan either, but the lady who owned it was alerting me to something that she knew was possible. Despite the circumstances, I wanted to leave carefully, because the situation was reaching its peak. When I met the mother of my children, I treated her as if nothing had happened, because we were supposedly friends. And during the friendship, she confessed to me that she was falling in love with a disciple much loved by Master Diaz Porta who lived in the Guadalajara ashram. And she had had her eye on him to marry, because she said he was a good person, very similar to me in many ways. A few days later, he told me they had to leave for Peru immediately. He already had the ticket. His parents, as always, had sent him the money he requested for this very important trip. This notable disciple of Master Diaz Porta was also going to travel, and she was determined to marry him there, given that she couldn't do so in Mexico, because her papers weren't completely in order. I was surprised by the news and asked him, Americo Living Trail 170, what are we going to do with the children? Don't worry, I have a friend who is going to stay with them in Teotihuacan. We said our goodbyes, but I remained confused, trying to sort through my thoughts, and on my way back, I mentioned it to my current partner. She began to get worried, aware that what was happening wasn't right. Especially because of how quickly she wanted to get married, and because who knows what would become of the children. It was for this reason that I made a delicate and definitive decision in my life as an initiate. On the one hand, I couldn't have the children with me, because I felt I was experiencing something very special, and it wasn't right to force my new partner to accept me and the children, but I wasn't willing to give up my happiness either. So, while my impromptu honeymoon was underway, I had to address the children's situation, realizing the danger they were in, especially the little girl, given that many types of people were already entering the Teotihuacan house, and could be sleeping here or there. Therefore, I couldn't be complacent, given that it was possible some of them were taking certain drugs in a good way. I reasoned that, given the circumstances, the children's tender sexuality would soon be threatened, all because of this atmosphere of stupid Aquarian liberation. The first thing I did was go to the office at the municipal palace in Netzahualcoyotl. There, I filed a report stating that the mother of my children was going to Peru, and abandoning the children. So, I left them with my mother to care for them, while I was away for periods of time due to work. I had just filed the corresponding report at the city hall, and I still didn't have the strength to act decisively. A typical judicial police officer was standing nearby. He had an aggressive look and a strong, but somewhat overweight build, although it was clear he knew what it was like to deal with very difficult people. So I approached him, and explained my case, as I also had to complete my paperwork at his office. He stared at me for a moment and then said, "The children are yours, you are the father, and a father does what he has to do for his children. She has fewer rights over your children than you do." This determined me to stay with the children, because I knew that their destiny would completely change. Later I would finally convince myself that I hadn't been mistaken, when I realized that the process of holding a judgment was quite long, especially because it was by mutual agreement, and, furthermore, it was quite difficult for her to want to attend the sessions. Having made my decision, I said to my mother, very seriously, "I need to talk to you. It's about the children." Americo Living Trail 171. She was willing to listen, and I asked her, "Do you want to stay with the children?" "What do you think you are going to do?" he asked me. "I've been summoned by force from my superiors, and they're starting to prepare me for a special assignment. I can't keep the children with me now. But if you don't want them, I'll find a way to place them elsewhere. You shouldn't feel obligated. I'll let you have the children only if you want. Think carefully. Do you want to?" "Of course," I affirm. And being aware of how things were going with my economy, I added, "But don't expect me to give you an expense or anything like that. I don't even know what's going to happen with my life. You'll have to trust in God, because they, the children, won't lack anything." I don't know what my mother thought at that moment, perhaps that her son had gone mad, or wise, or perhaps that she always saw him as very strange, and it was only natural that this would happen someday. The fact is that she was brave, and accepted them in exchange for knowing that her son is not wrong, because when he had to answer for his father and his family, he did so responsibly, and that if he was leaving now, it was because there was truly something higher calling him. In that sense, she knew me. Shortly after, when I knew the mother of my children was already on her way to Peru, my partner and I arrived in Teotihuacan. I examined the state of neglect the children were in, and was able to predict their future fate. So right there, I grabbed the little ones, their birth certificates, papers, and all their clothes. I threw them in the trunk of my current partner's car, and headed back to Netzahualcoyotl City, to leave them there with their grandparents. My mother dared to ask me, "When are you going to send for all the things in the house of Teotihuacan?" Inside, I quickly remembered that there are times in the lives of both the initiated and the insane, when they completely abandon everything, and if they don't do so, it brings dangerous problems in the future. I didn't want any connection with the mother of my children, any excuse to increase the fuss. And I answered her, "Forget it, we have to leave everything to them. The only thing I care about is that those children don't have to live among the orgies and drugs of all these homeless people." He wasn't very happy, but he accepted. This was the trigger for a huge persecution that the GFU community was going to inflict on me. And at the same time, it was also a very special and invaluable opportunity to realize what the people who called themselves conscious really were. Americo Living Trail 172. The first thing my ex-partner did, when she arrived from Peru, after a failed attempt to get married there, was to search for me everywhere. She told everyone who knew me about my ruthless and cruel behavior. It even spread to the initiation schools, and angry groups gathered in the pre-initiation schools, because I had stolen their children from the poor mother. So, organizing themselves into a network, they began trying to locate me. Furthermore, my new companion was accused of being a seductress, and I was considered to have fallen into temptation. I had lost the path of the masters of the GFU, all because of a woman who did not belong to Master Estrada's institution, with whom I fell madly in love. Fortunately, I had nothing more to do at the Shea Mission centers, so I stopped going there. I had to begin my true retreat. This time, no one had to know where I was, because it didn't seem fair to bother the woman who was with me, even though I knew she wasn't just any woman. I still tried to work with my father for a while, because he needed money. And I realized that, although he treated me harshly throughout my life, he still loved and respected me deeply. He didn't interfere in my affairs, and treated me the same way he always did. When I went, he never complained about the children, and although he loved the children's mother, he never questioned anything. But it so happened that I realized I was carrying something with my very energy, because just as I wanted to be here, and at the same time continue my retreat, my father's small workshop was shut down. I set out to defend him at all costs, and I went to the bosses at the treasury offices, to try to resolve the tax issue. And I raised my voice loudly at the treasury offices. That was when we were living in the Del Valle neighborhood, near Insurgent Sewer Avenue. The masters, through my new partner, told me, "Understand this once and for all, that's not for you anymore. The symbol of your father's workshop being closed is, that it's closed for you." Even later, after my consecration at 33, I contacted one of my brothers, and worked with him for a few days, installing blinds for the windows of the large Pemex building, but that money didn't go far. My destiny was changing radically, and I couldn't understand it. Only by meditating and remaining still, in a contemplative state, could I feel well. Visiting Jalapa and Cotepec, the teachers said that there would soon be a very strong earthquake in Mexico, and that it would help a lot to cushion it, if I left the children in a safe place, and went with my current partner to Veracruz, to visit the ashram of Cotepec, and make contact with the sacred center. Americo Living Trail 173. We had nothing to lose, we had a little money, so we sorted things out, and headed off to Jalapa, Veracruz. By then, I was still attending Shea's Center, but the astrology and naturism groups had already been combined into one. We packed our things,